next generation lithography. So we were talking about soft lithography. We had covered some basics, many different ways how we classify soft lithography, many different ways how we do things. But the general idea stays the same. We use soft lithography because it provides us access to 3D and curved structures. We can put patterns on various type of structures, and it gives us a wide access to a wide variety of materials. We can generate well-defined and very controlled surface chemistries using soft lithography. And many times the material that we use, PDMS, for example, is compatible for bio application. So it's inert, it's biologically not reactive, non-reactive, but it gives us access to make many different chemistries. It's also low cost, and experimentally it's convenient to do on a just a simple benchtop. We can do lots of things with soft lithography. So this has emerged as a way of doing lots of bio applications like cell biology or microfluidics, lab on chip, MEMS even. So we have made many MEMS devices with this thing called soft lithography. And we also do now what's very hot, flexible substrate, flexible electronics. So the soft lithography is also helping us there, right? So idea, as we can see, we have a master, and the master pattern can be made of PDMS itself. It can be a hard material. And then we put the ink, which would be the molecules that we want to transfer or the molecules that we want to coat it with, functionalize with, and we contact with the substrate, and that gives us a monolayer of wherever we contact. So many different ways of how soft lithography is used. So today we want to talk about imprint lithography. So imprint is an idea that we can fabricate nanometer scale patterns. It's a lithography process in a way that we are taking a pattern and we are using a resist, but our pattern or our master, we push it in the resist, and we remove the resist from our raised parts. Like here it's shown the yellow thing. Yellow is the resist. So the red one, when you push it with force, it's going to remove yellow from wherever the raised portions are. So that's a very simple, basic example. But there are now many different types of advanced ways of how nano imprint technology is being used. So nano imprint is also low cost, and it can give you high throughput because you can have a big stem and you can have a whole big wafer, 6-inch, 8-inch wafer, and you can imprint the whole thing in one go. And that imprinting can give us patterns because of mechanical deformation of the resist, right? And then we may or we may not have to. Number two, what it's saying, once it has created the pattern, we have solidified, then there may be some resist left. We can do etching, and etching can remove those places where thin resist is left. So which means then we can get to the wafer or the substrate below. So this process was originally developed exactly as a next generation lithography tool to even replace electron beam lithography. So this is newer than e-beam lithography as well. So this is next generation lithography. And as much as they have achieved 10 nanometer holes, 40 nanometer apart in PMMA. PMMA is another resist, another polymer on a metal substrate, SiA. And the uniformity was very excellent over 1 square inch, which means that the height of the features we got and the formation of the feature was very uniform. So this is now a process which uses a hard mold, where we have made on the mold, we make predetermined nano features that need to be transferred. We bring it on the film, on the substrate, we press it down, we remove it, and that pattern is transferred. So we have to use external force to really, really uniformly, very precisely bring it in parallel. That's the basic imprint lithography. But then there are newer examples that we'll talk about where you don't have both of those things don't have to be flat. There we can use a curved mask as well. So now once we have transferred the pattern, so in some cases we may have some residual material polymer left at the bottom. That's where we do an isotropic etching. In isotropic, if you remember, it's a very selective directional etching, where we would etch more in vertical than horizontal, which means we would remove the residue at the bottom. And here on the right hand side, if you look at the number 4 picture at the bottom, by using that nil resist, so we call it nil also, nano imprint lithography, NIL. So nil resist has been used to now etch down into the substrate. So we have used the nil pattern now to go down into the hard substrate and transfer the pattern below, right? So this is where now we have transferred from the polymer into the hard surface as well. So this etching can be done with, mostly we do dry etching, reactive ion etcher, RIE, which would expose the underlying substrate for whatever next processing step is going to come, right? So with hand, I made this thing that, so you can have, first you can do one side, and if the need be, we flip the wafer and we can do it on the other side also. So we can do dual side lithography as well in some cases, some use cases, whatever the case be. All right, so here's a question, same as soft? No, no. Nano imprint lithography is not soft lithography. The basic difference is, in soft lithography, we were using 3D structures. We are using polymer to transfer. Here, the substrate can be hard metal, hard material, right? So, and we are making structures in the hard matter itself. Soft lithography is soft substrate, polymers, right? So we make it, and then we may attach that soft polymer onto a hard substrate in soft lithography. Here, what we are doing, we are making things ultimately in the hard material. Question, Emmett, go ahead.
Sir, can we are using acids to remove the oxidations or masks, sir?
So in this case, we are not using mask for the imprinting process, for the lithography process. We may have made the master that we are using to stamp, or master or mold. We may have made that using E-beam lithography or maybe a mask. But now, once that has been made, we are just stamping, bring one wafer, stamp it, get the other wafer, keep on stamping it. Instead of doing the serial E-beam writing now, we write serial E-beam writing to get a mold, like green one shown here, and we keep on using that to transfer the pattern physically on the. And now, in this case, we are using a resist, but we call this resist as nil resist, right? Nano imprinting lithography resist, because this resist has different properties. It may not be optically reactive, but there is example where we use UV light to localized what do you call? It's called soft UV nil. We'll talk about that on the next slide. In that case, what we do is while we have done the imprinting, while we have pushed it down, then we use UV to cure, to harden the resist, but not to do what we were traditionally doing in lithography, in optical lithography, where the light were used to being transfer the pattern. Here, what we will be using UV is to only harden the resist. So we still call it resist. Yeah, go ahead.
Sir, in general, how many times can nano print stamps be reused, sir?
Very interesting question. Yeah. How many times that mold can be used to keep on printing? It depends. It depends on the material of the, but you are very right. After certain X number of use, the mold will become, uh, the patterns on the mold will become, well, when they get destroyed, they get smaller, they would lose their walls, maybe they will not become, they will not be as sharp as they are at the end, at the start. So yes, there is a life, but that life depends on what is the imprint, what is the mold material, what is the, what do you call, minimum resolvable size. So too small size will become bad quicker. If you have bigger size design, then they would go longer. Then there is this process, instead of, like right now what we are looking is we have to imprint, which means we need to physically push it down to remove the polymer, remove that material, the light gray thing, to make room. But if you use very soft resist, like we're going to see in the next slide, then the resist will not be as mechanically damaging to the mold. So there are few factors that go into how many times you can use. But yes, the question is valid. Each mold will have its own life, that how many times it can be used to stem. Right? Now, the full wafer nanoprint lithography has been achieved using what we call soft UV nanoprint lithography. Right? So that's process coming up next slide. But compared to IC industry, so this has found some niche areas, some very specialized areas where there is much wider application of nanoprint lithography. So like LEDs, I'll give you an example of that. All right, so laser assisted direct imprinting. So what we are doing is we are pushing the mold into the hard material itself. Now the material, the hard material is being made soft by application of laser. So laser is resulting into the 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 wafer, the substrate itself, the upper layer to become soft, so the mold can get pressed inside, right? But in this case, you have to know that this cannot, you cannot have enough energy for silicon. So these would be again soft lithography type of things, where the polymer is hard and polymer is made to be soft to transfer the pattern into the substrate. Right now, the resist can be thermoplastic, which once we have pushed it down, we can heat up the stage. And there is a thing called, for every polymer, there is a temperature above. If you heat it above that temperature, the polymer becomes glass, which means it becomes hard. Glassification, that's a process, glassification. And that temperature is called TG, glassification temperature. So while you push it down, we can heat up, so our resist can go above TG. And as soon as it goes, we take the mold out, which means that as soon as it hardens, uh, we remove the mold as soon as the temperature comes down the TG. Right now, the mold can be cured by heat, or it can be done by UV also. So there are different ways how polymers are cured. So curing is the step where polymer becomes hardened, becomes changes phase from soft, liquidy to hard. So I was talking about S-fill, step and flash lithography. So this is where once the mold presses down and we have the design is made, we apply UV, which would cure the monomer, cure the polymer molecules, harden them, and then you can just remove the mold from the substrate, right? So simple nano-imprint lithography, where we push things in the resist, let it solidify, which can be done by heat, which can be done by UV, right? And in soft UV nil, we can imprint on non-flat surfaces as well. Because in this case, you bring it down, so you don't have to necessarily hard push because the monomer is in liquid state. So this can be done on non-flat substrates as well, which would give us much more flexibility in making things on curved surfaces, or what we call nowadays the flexible electronics or flexible substrates. So there's a huge range of uses. I'm just sharing the LED patterning where you can, so this A is showing you the close-up view of different materials that would be patterned. The B is showing you the actual LEDs. You can see thousands of LEDs can be created with that pattern. And that pattern is then shown on the extreme right. That pattern results into all those holes where this we have the metal contacts made, we have the photonic crystal that's deposited, and we have the microwave, the wave guided light is coming out of that specific LED. So you can make whole bunch of thousands of LEDs together. And the lower one is giving lots of examples from many places. So the second reference here is about this book chapter where they have talked a lot more about various applications of doing anti-reflective coatings, making organic LEDs, which these new TVs, television sets, the curved TV sets, which have LED TVs, they use organic LEDs, solar cells, flexible films. So there's lots of uses of nano imprint lithography to make structures in a very well-defined way. So to wrap up our discussion on next generation lithography, there are pluses, there are minuses. So we can do single molecule or few molecule kind of thing, where we can pattern the surface with dip pen. We have micro contact printing. We have parallel dip pen, which can increase our throughput. Instead of just one, it can give us many of those features made in parallel on a surface. We have talked about AFM, using the scanning probe to do many things, where we may be scratching the surface, we may be oxidizing the surface, we may be electrically changing the surface properties using that. Millipede is again the same thing, where you have thousands of tips that can come in parallel and they can put molecules down, right? So the right one is stencil, is where you would have a kind of you made a design and then you go over the whole thing, wherever there is opening, that will result into putting the molecules or changing the substrate depending on application. All right, questions on next generation lithography or nano imprint lithography? All right, so let's get into another area called nanomaterials. So nanomaterials, we have discussed about lithography, next generation lithography. In all the cases, what we are doing was we were trying to make things at nanoscale, right? So, but our approach was to etch bigger things and make smaller things. We call this top-down fabrication, making of nanomaterials in a top-down fashion. We start big and we start cutting them down, or we do etching or patterning, whatever. So chips, processors, RAMs, non-volatile memories, all these are applications of what we call top-down fabrication, right? The other way to nanomaterial is what you call bottom-up. So bottom-up is that we would build things atom by atom, right? Like Lego blocks. You know, Lego blocks, we bring those together and we give a shape. So bottom-up synthesis or bottom-up nanofabrication. We use different names, so don't get confused. Whenever we use bottom up, we straight away understand that we are talking about manufacturing by using the properties of atoms or molecules, right? So when we talk about nanomaterials, we do both ways, but we do a lot more of bottom up. So a lot of chemistry goes into that. Sometimes we have a kind of a recipe. Many times now we have recipes to make things that if you do mix these things, you heat that up, or SOP, you would definitely get nanomaterials at the end result. So we know a lot of those things. But then in literature, you find different, we refer to these things in different ways. Like somewhere you read clusters, somewhere you use colloidal solutions, somewhere we say nanoparticles, somewhere you see nanocrystal. They all are in the same size scale, but many times how they come together or what are their specific properties that differentiate. For example, nanocrystal, quantum dots belong to nanocrystals, although they are nanoparticles by size, right? So nanoparticle is, but it says it's a solid particle in size range of 1 to 100 nanometer. That could be non-crystalline, that could be crystalline, and that could be an optical crystal. Now it's a nanoparticle, but we call it quantum dot, right? Or we would call it nanocrystal, because just to differentiate between, we are not just talking about a nanoparticle, but we are talking about a nanoparticle that's crystal and it has optical properties, right? So many times we use words that would belong to many definitions, but that particular name would have become associated with that kind of application or its properties. So cluster is when some of them come together, about 50 units. We call that cluster. Nanoparticles would cluster up unless we have some surfactant to provide them, so they don't clump together. So they don't have those forces, don't bring them together. Colloidal solutions are particles in 1 to 1000 nanometer, but if they are dissolved, not dissolved, they are hanging in a solution, in a liquid. So they are stably hanging around in a liquid, stable liquid. When I say dissolve, I just want to make a distinction that when you put sodium chloride in water, it dissolves, which means it forms ions of sodium chloride. But this would, what we mean by colloidal solution, those particles would maintain their crystalline structure or not their shape, but they would be floating around in the solution. They are not dissolved, but they're suspended. So we call that kind of solution as a suspension. It's the same thing like you see on some drugs, the liquid syrups, it says suspension. All that means is the drug molecules are not dissolved, but they're suspended in whatever liquid they come in. So we call them colloidal solutions. And they are nothing but suspended nanoparticles, right? Stable. There are some other ways how we define as well, depending on what top down or bottom up. So if you come top down, you have a one phase, one type nanomaterials which clump together and make a big bulk kind of mass, right? Here it is shown in, it's like a brick. It doesn't have to be a brick. It can be in any shape. But the idea is they would be single phase, all of them come together and make a big chunk. They can be different mixture of one or two or three kind of things which can come together and create a big mass. So in that case, that nanomaterial we would talk that in terms of the surface. And then when you crush them into small, either we may be putting them on a surface, they may be suspended in a solid while before we solidify something, or they may be airborne, right? Now everybody knows about coronavirus. So coronavirus is airborne. It's a nanomaterial, right? It's a small, what is its size? 80 to 200 nanometer. It's an airborne nanomaterial. So we have different ways how we read in literature about nanomaterials. We can take one material and we can adjust its properties to get many different varieties. So this is a fantastic example. Dr. Wang from Georgia Tech, he works on zinc oxide. I saw this slide a few years ago. Ignore the color. Color is just pseudo color. They have just colored it. They've taken an SEM image or TM image and they've just put the color. What's interesting is this is all zinc oxide and nanoscale. And by playing with intermediary molecules or by playing with the end groups or functional groups, they have created self-assembled nanostructures from zinc oxide. Same material, just by playing with their chemistry, some parts here and there, we can create many different forms and shape of nanomaterial. All right, so as I said, does airborne means floating in it? Exactly. So when we go below 5 micrometer, gravity loses its effect on things, which means things which are below in size than 3 micrometer would be floating around. So airborne means things floating around in the air. Now there are specific words that go if there are liquid particles, liquid small droplets, tiny droplets, we call that aerosolization, right? So those would be, the liquid would be carrying those particles with itself. The liquid droplet would be carrying those things. So there are many different ways how we get things airborne. But yes, airborne is floating in air because it's not feeling any gravity. It's going to stay suspended. Okay, question. Now, there are nanomaterials which can be defined by their size, by their characteristics, by their applications. It's a table. Let me I have broken it down into smaller pieces. We'll look at some of those probably next lecture. But let me just give you some introduction that carbon-based nanomaterials it's a class in itself. Carbon nanotubes, graphene, and of course, buckyballs, C60. But then on the living side, when we go to biomolecules, there is a whole range of things. So dendrimers are size less than nanometers. They're highly branched polymer network, which is made, we control its polymerization, right? So it has a core, branch, and a surface. So we call them dendrimers. They have been used in living systems. They have been used to target specific organs in the living systems. When I say living system, many of these things have been tested in animals. Many of these things have become part of drugs that we use or therapies. So they're already different stages. So if they belong to nanomaterial, that doesn't automatically mean that they're bad for us. But we have to know how they are made, what is their specific properties to distinguish them, and what have been some applications. And this is a book from 2016, fairly recent. So it has a good recent knowledge in it. So liposopes are 50 to 100 nanometer. These are phospholipid vesicles. So we remember phospholipid bilayer. So those are the chains that we use, and we use their vesicles. So we make vesicles with them that are 50 to 100 nanometer size. So we use many of these things to put things in them and send into living system to carry out whatever the function, whether that's genetic manipulation, whether you want to send proteins, peptides, so they can carry lots of load and deliver those things in living systems. Nanoparticles, CNTs. We'll talk about CNTs, Hamza. We'll talk about carbon nanotubes.
Sir?
Yeah.
Sir, in previous slide, you talk about bottom lines, right? Sir, so what is the bottom line on nanotechnology impact of
Bottom line,
human health and environment? Like, sir, in other words, the application of very small technologies still carries some very big questions about where these materials are being used, how they are
fourth,
behaving, and what is need to protect ourselves, sir.
fourth column is the application. There are examples of application given right here. So there are applications that are already out there. We are using liposomes to deliver drug. They are used as therapy. So there are actual applications of these things which are happening now.
I said, sir, about human health and the environment protection, sir. How
We
these
discussed that.
effects.
Yeah, so we discussed, okay, yeah, we will look at some of the nanomaterials and their impact or open questions related to that. Yeah,
Yeah, sir.
so this is an overview, but we'll get into 5, 6 nanomaterials that are in very advanced stage right now. So we'll discuss those.
Like, sir, in KPR1, sir, I was reading, sir, they mentioned that, sir, very small technologies still carry some very big question about where these materials are still being used, sir.
Right, yeah. So toxic effects of many nanomaterials are not known. And toxic, yeah, don't be scared, but toxic just means that the decomposition, the natural decomposition in a living system to smaller parts, so they can get out of the body. If the body cannot do that, this means they remain stuck somewhere. If they remain stuck somewhere in living system, yeah, so body would have its own reaction to those things. Short term, long term, we know many of the things, we don't know many of the things, but that's an important question which should be addressed when we talk about specific nanomaterials, right? So here we are just introducing various classes and various types of nanomaterials that are there, right? So nanoparticles, when you hear about nanoparticles, it's nothing but very small version of something that exists big, right? Gold nanoparticles. The gold, small powder, if you can call it, right? Ground. So that now, when I say ground, I give you an idea of top down, right? Doing something big. No, we make these bottom up also. But powdery, the idea is it's a very, very fine powder. Gold, silver, there are other titanium, zinc oxide, you saw that. So there are so many types where we can make nanoparticles. So they are also being used for drug and gene delivery. There are quantum dots. So quantum dots are nanoparticles, but these are crystalline material nanoparticles with optical properties, which means that you can excite them with the wavelength and they would give out a wavelength. They are bright fluorescence materials. And they give very narrow emission, which means the wavelength is very precise in one or few hundreds, tens of nanometers range for that matter. And they have huge fluorescence, huge intensity of light. Polymeric micelles, again, these are copolymer micelles. So these are, again, things made of polymers under 10 to 100 nanometer. They can also carry drug molecules, they can carry payloads. When you say payload, that can be drug molecules, that can be genes, that can be a specific protein, this can be even a virus that can be carried in them, right? And then we have polymeric nanoparticles. So polymeric nanoparticles is again very small particle, small powdery thing, small powder that can be delivered, that can be tagged with things, it can carry stuff with it and go through living systems and deliver whatever they're supposed to be doing there. So basic introduction to nanomaterial will continue this discussion.